He means, and other means today, that the primary focus for this transatlantic link for the future, instead of NATO, is going to be the TTIP, which is the abbreviation for the Transatlantic Free Trade and Investment Agreement. When the negotiations that we have been discussing between Europe and the United States now for over 20 years, when these negotiations start now in a couple of weeks when Obama is going to visit Europe, this very ambitious project with an even more, I would say, ambitious timetable will be the new driving source of this relationship across the Atlantic. And therefore, instead of being primarily viewed through a military, sort of hard military lens, the focus will now instead be on trade and investments and on political cooperation. Here the US primary focus, instead of being on military spending levels, might be on issues related to the service directive, agriculture issues, but also mutual recognition of standards. And if the EU-US relationship is rebalanced in this way, away from hard security issues towards closer economic and political cooperation, of course, this will also affect European security overall, but it could also be a signal that we have to step up the Nordic-Baltic cooperation to answer up to this changed reality. Other factors, of course, that or could mean that we should put a larger focus on regional cooperation in our areas, it is the challenges that are facing the European Union. Instead of being a push forward, the period after the Lisbon Treaty has been one of backtracking when it comes to military and security cooperations. Institutional challenges side by side with the lingering economic crisis that now risk spilling over into a political crisis in the European Union has put doubts in the EU's capacity to be an important player on security-related issues. This also has meant that there has been a larger focus on regional arrangements, such as the Nordic-Baltic issues, and or Nordic-Baltic cooperation. And if the EU is not getting its act together here, of course, this focus might need to be shifted up. Here, however, I wanted to just put in one note of caution. Even if there is a larger focus on the increased need of cooperation on regional issues, I think it's important to note that the European Union remains a primary vehicle for many of the Nordic-Baltic countries, including Sweden, when facing global challenges of today, both on a regional and a global level. And therefore, I think it is a common interest also from the Nordic-Baltic countries to ensure that the European Union is able to manage this role also in the future. And here, just before concluding, I just wanted to mention a strategy that UE has been working on together with the leading institutes in Poland, Italy, and Spain on exactly how the European Union should act as a global actor. It's called the European Global Strategy, and we will launch this tomorrow at 10 o'clock. So I just wanted to tell you that. But anyway, an active involvement and engagement of societies on all levels could ensure a more close cooperation on security issues between the Nordic-Baltic countries. And with these perspectives of a changed role for NATO and a different European Union, this might not only be important, but actually necessary.
Thank you, Anna. Of course. You talked a lot about the Nordic-Baltic cooperation, but isn't that more about diplomacy and business and less about people actually meeting and feeling a sense of belonging?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we have heard different views, not least from the defense ministry here, but I have to say when traveling in the Baltic countries, there is a very, for me, I feel that there is a very firm presence of the Nordic interest in these countries. I mean, first of all, the Nordic embassies have very sort of primary locations in the different capitals in the Baltic countries, but also the presence of, for instance, Swedbank, even though we understood that there is also a negative connotation here. But I think the massive presence of Swedish banks still in these countries is something that is also signaling why we must work closer together. So I think there is a lot of people who are traveling to the Baltic countries, increasingly so, for vacation, but also for the business community, that they have to work closer together. So I have to say that also when you speak about Nordic-Baltic cooperation in Sweden, you feel that there is a very big understanding for that these are countries that we must work closer with. And I'm not really sure that I agree here with Mike. Maybe that I think that generally in Sweden there is a feeling that we should work closer with the Baltic countries than, for instance, other countries in the European Union, such as France. However, there might be a political interest to work very closely with countries like France and the UK.
I see. You also mentioned that focus is shifting. And I take it that you speak of soft power more, that soft power and economics are more and more important. But then again, Edward said that we need to spend more on military. How do you feel about that?
Well, as I said, I'm sure that there is going to be still a rather big focus, not least from the United States, that the Europeans should share the burden on military spending within NATO. But at the same time, if now these negotiations on this new transatlantic free trade and investment agreement start, I don't think we should underestimate that this will really be the driving force in the transatlantic relationship, and this will have repercussions also for NATO and therefore also for hard security issues in Europe. So I think that this is an issue that must be taken into account in these discussions.
Okay, thank you, Anna. And now we will have a brief discussion between the three panelists, and then maybe in 20 minutes I will open up for you guys. So Edward, you had a comment on Mike's speech and maybe on Anna's as well.
Yes, and I think there's a danger of being a bit complacent on this hard power threat and saying one could very easily go from saying it doesn't matter to saying we can't do anything. And by the time you realise that there's a threat, it may already be too late, too late to do it. And I think that we have seen in Georgia that Russia is willing to break what had been a post-1991 or post-1992 taboo of engaging in military operations across its borders. And these are real worries if you live next to Russia. And the Pentagon does scenario planning, and they look at things like the Narva grab and the Kaliningrad blockade, where the Russians would complain that Kaliningrad was being blockaded and then try and get a corridor. And you may say this is only a 1% chance or a 5% chance or 10% chance. I certainly wouldn't put any more than that, but I think it's unwise to exclude it ab initio and say there is no danger of a hard power, of a military conflict. By the time you change your mind, it may be too late to do anything about it. And I do think that part of what Russia's doing now, and I agree with Minister Pabriks very much, is to create this feeling of indefensibility, to create the feeling that there's nothing really you can do. Unfortunately, you're in the wrong neighborhood. This is a very unpleasant and powerful message you get from some bits of the American defense and security establishment, where they say, what a pity, those poor Baltics, they're just in the wrong neighborhood. In the end, there's nothing we can really do about it. And so this I think you have to watch out, because that's on your doorstep. I also think both my fellow panelists, I think, have overstated American commitment to Europe or understated the danger of the American pullout. I don't think TAFTA or TTIP is going to change the military picture. It's great that there's 90,000 people in suits and uniforms in Europe. But do you know how many American soldiers are being sent to Steadfast Jazz? One company. One company to the most important military maneuvers in Europe since the end of the Cold War. America can afford to send one company. That's really devastating. The last American tanks, the American tanks that arrived at D-Day, left Europe at the beginning of April. Obviously not the same tanks, but I mean, for the first time since D-Day, there are no American tanks in Europe, and they're not coming back. The idea, the agreement at the Chicago summit was that there would be a rotation out of Europe, but we'd make up for that by having lots of maneuvers to maintain the interoperability that was the big dividend of Afghanistan. If Afghanistan was a disaster in every other respect, it wasn't a disaster in terms of military training and interoperability. Now it's time to cash that check, cash that promise, do the manoeuvres, and it turns out there's no money for manoeuvres because manoeuvres are really expensive. So there's a serious problem there. I haven't heard any real mention of Poland, except I think in the slightly misleading context that the Polish-Lithuanian row over spelling is a serious defence problem. I don't think that's the way of looking at it. What worries me about the Polish-Lithuanian relationship is part of the broader failure of regional policy here. It's the fact we don't have a gas pipeline. You know, they can argue about spelling. On the military side, the NATO contingency plans for the defence of the Baltic states involve 1/3 of the Polish army being deployed in Lithuania. That's a major, that's what a security commitment involves. I don't see any sign of anything like that coming from Sweden or Finland in the foreseeable future. Poland is absolutely central. If we're going to talk about this Baltic region, we have to talk about it with Poland. But there is a big hole, and that's on this boring but important stuff of transport and energy. No railway, no proper motorway, no gas pipelines, no proper common thinking about energy security. The EU's done a very good job, I agree with that, but that's coming from Brussels. It's not being matched by regional cooperation on the ground.
Thank you, Ed. So, Mike, innovation is old school. I don't think Ed agrees.
I don't disagree with what Edward said this time, either with some nuances actually, but I think that the major problem with the current situation, if we prolong it, including then the arms buildup on the Russian side, is actually still not invasions, but the fact that the Russians can intimidate all the countries involved to do what they want anyway. This is the, Sun Tzu kind of way of fighting wars. You don't need to invade people. They do what you wish anyway. And you can do that much more easy if you have a very, very large military power behind you. So that's the key thing here. However, though, on the Americans, I kind of agree. I don't agree in the sense that tanks in themselves are necessary to have here right now. Tanks are necessary for certain forms of warfighting, to be sure. What the Americans keep in Europe, very consciously as well, are the most expeditionary forces that they have, the 2nd Cavalry and the Airborne Brigade in Italy. These are the actual units that can really be tripwire forces should need arise in the Baltic states, for example. And they also have a number of other assets like SEAD focusing F-16s, suppression of enemy air defenses, like the Apaches in Germany as well, the assault helicopters and so on. I mean, for tripwire forces in a non-invasion scenario, this is exactly what you want to have, actually. The problem, though, is if things get worse, then you have to reinforce this in ways that was heavily exercised during the Cold War and haven't been exercised at all the last 20 years or so. And this is a problem if they don't start doing that. You could add on the problem on the political side as well, that given the experiences right now when Secretary of State John Kerry visited Moscow, had to wait for 3 hours before he got to see Mr. Putin, or was consciously delayed for 3 hours before he got to see Mr. Putin. On top of that, you have the CIA thing, you have the potential selling or transferring at least of S-300s to Syria. A lot of things that happened just in the very event of his visit to Moscow. I mean, I can see a message here, apparently. And the only American answer has been that, well, we still want to work with Russia on different things like the Northern Distribution Framework and terrorism in Syria and what have you. So there is virtually no reaction to this. And my very limited understanding of Russia is that if they see an answer like that, they continue to push this guy around. And that is a problem that might be of concern, at least for the short term. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Anna, you mentioned that there is an increased American interest in Europe in terms of economy, but we hear that there is a decreased interest in terms of military. How do you react on this?
No, this is exactly my point. That if the transatlantic relationship now is going to be driven rather by trade and investments instead of being driven by hard power, this is going to have effects also on the security of the Nordic-Baltic region. But I think also, I mean, to just enlarge the discussion a little bit on Russia, I was in Moscow last week, and they are very clearly reiterating the same messages that they see now for the challenges of security. It's the missile defense, it is the NATO enlargement, and it is the forced change of government in different countries in the region. And then on top of that, they are reiterating these messages, but at the same time being also very clear on that they don't feel that the West is listening. They don't understand their arguments, and they do not want to engage with the Russian point of view. And this is, of course, a message that is very sort of helpful for their own domestic activities and so on. But here there is, of course, a larger problem as well, and that is that we have the very challenging security situation in our region, but we also have this need of being able to cooperate with Russia on other issues, such as Syria, for instance. And here, I think also we are so locked into this situation that it's very, very difficult today to see a way out with Russia for the future when it comes to sort of the broader security relationship as well. And this is something I think should maybe be also a part of this discussion.
Mike.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point on the changing things in the transatlantic field. If the fundamental logic for the pivot or the rebalancing is the rise of China in military and economic terms, and this is what forces the United States to go to Asia and to be much more engaged in Asia for all kinds of precautionary purposes. Then if Russia is rearming very much, and to do a rearmament process the way they want to, they will need a very strong economy as well, and we don't know if they will be able to sustain that. But still, if that happens, I'm pretty sure that the American interest for this part of the world will continue, because then you have a very strong, very militarily powerful, and also economically well-financed actor that could do a lot of mischief in this part of the world, and that will certainly increase the American attention for this. If Russia goes down the drain, on the other hand, I mean, people are giving these kind of predictions as well at times, then we could see another issue, but that solves a few other questions too, on the other hand.
Well, I think that a Russia that's in trouble and going down the drain may also be a Russia that's very troublesome to deal with. So I think one shouldn't assume that either that Russian economic strength or Russian economic weakness correlates one way or another with Russia as a friendly neighbour. So I just would put a footnote on that. And I see lots of people who I think have more interesting things to say than me with their hands up, so I'm going to wait for them to.
Of course, we'll also have a session about Russia later, so we can talk more about that. Is there something one of you want to say before we open up for the audience? Okay, first is Anders Åslund. You can borrow my mic.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. What I think that we should focus on here, it's not the hard military response that is dangerous. It's all the other things. And President Ilves is very focused on cyber war. That is one of the three top topics in Washington today. China, Syria, and cyber war. These are really the three big things. Matthes Bryza talked about the information war. He wants to do the same with information war that Ilves has done with cyber war. And one example of this is the Latvian referendum on the Russian language last year, but it's only one of many. And this case that he brought up of military training by Latvians in Russia, it's totally outrageous. If this was in the United States, these people would be arrested as terrorists coming home, and that's probably the right treatment. There must be a law change there. And also probably on the information side, where it's very difficult to see what is right from a freedom of media side and what is simply provocation. And then finally, the most important, that's corruption. There must be a massive transparency in order to show all payments. We have, for example, former Prime Minister Paavo Lipponen working for Nord Stream. We have a lot of Russian money in various contexts. We have seen one president in Lithuania being impeached for taking dirty Russian money for his campaign, and now he's back in politics. Similarly, we saw one prime minister in Lithuania being ousted for the same thing, and now he's back in politics as well. Should this really be allowed to happen? If you have been caught out red-handed in corruption in such a fashion, you should be taken out of politics. Thank you.
One more question and then the answers.
A question to Ed Lucas, and I do it from a position as a chairman not only of this think tank but also chairman of the Baltic Parliamentary Network in the Swedish Parliament. Just started off with my friend Urban Ahlin from the Social Democrats, and we gather some 42 MPs from 7 parties who are particularly interested in Baltic matters, which is a sign of a growing interest even among Swedish politicians. My question to Edward is about his latest book, Deception, which should be read by everyone. In that book you tell the story of Herman Sim, who is the Estonian equivalent to Stig Wennerström, the main traitor, now imprisoned for life. How come that man could become an Estonian representative to NATO and sell out and hurt NATO when the Swedish security police knew who he was and he was not allowed to travel to Sweden? Can you explain to us how he could make such a distinguished career in Estonia, which is not an easy-fooled country?
Go on.
Thank you. We have more questions later. I'll let you answer the 2 first.
I'll try and summarize 2 chapters of my book in 6 sentences. Herman Sim was the top security official in the Estonian Defense Ministry. And he was probably the most damaging, I wouldn't say the most damaging Russian spy in NATO. He's the most damaging Russian spy in NATO that we know of. But we also know that in Russian espionage doctrine, they usually run 2 agents at the same source. So that implies that if they were running Sim, there must be someone else. And we all wonder who that was. I think that the Russians are very good at reading the way, first of all, at reading human weaknesses, and secondly, at spotting the way political patronage networks work. And Herman Sim had a huge advantage in Estonia, which was that he had the right enemies. He'd been fired twice by the Edgar Savisaar, from the Centre Party, and the Centre Party is regarded in Estonia as being a kind of Russian front. I think wrongly, actually. I'm less harsh on the Centre Party than some people are, but there's a number of patriotic parties in Estonia, whether they're liberals or conservatives or whatever, who all don't like the Centre Party. And the fact that Herman Sim had been fired twice in his previous career by the Centre Party gave him a kind of Perselschein, a kind of political white ticket, which meant that helped him very much in his career. But I still find it worrying. I mean, the other thing that's shocking about Herman Sim was that he was not just spying for the Russians, he was spying for the Germans. He was an agent of the BND as well, and possibly of other security services too. There's a lot of interesting leads that I didn't go into in the book. Let nobody say the Estonians aren't entrepreneurial. But it's a source of astonishment to me that both the Finns and the Swedes had information on Herman Sim, and for some reason it never got to the decision makers in Estonia in a form that they acted on. I just want to follow up also on what Anders said. I think we've got a really profound problem when it comes to information security. During the Cold War, we knew we were in an existential struggle against a totalitarian superpower that used propaganda against us, and we fought back. We had psychological warfare people in our military. In America, we had the United States Information Agency. We had a lot of different agencies and organizations, some of them state, some of them quasi-state, some of them public broadcasters, some of them NGOs. And we fought back quite hard and quite well. We disarmed. We had unilateral information disarmament at the end of the Cold War because we thought that in a free society, you have a free media and it will win, a kind of utopian approach, I think. Now Russia is fighting back hard. It never really disarmed, and it's now rearming fast on the information front, and it's doing it very skillfully and very successfully. Don't laugh at Russian efforts. People like us can watch Russia today, and we think it's ridiculous. It's not aimed at us. It's aimed at the wider population. And I don't know what the answer is. We have to start a conversation. In a way, it's almost more difficult than the conversation about spending more on defense. We have to start a conversation about how we do information security.
Do you want to comment, Mike?
Yeah, I was just commenting the same thing that Ed started with here. On Anders' comments on non-military issues. Well, of course, I mean, in today's world, we have a much broader kind of palette of things that are important for our security. Cyber issues, cybersecurity being one of them. Energy security being certainly for a country like Lithuania, their number one priority, for example. But this is not to say that all the other threats are gone or that all the other means that we use against these threats should not be dealt with. It's a broader conception, which means that we keep everything, or at least most of the things we had, and then we add on a lot of other skills. That's the way to do it. And that's also a way to do it. The way to do that, in my mind, is to do it in a cooperative way in this security complex, promoting it being a security community. In the NBA concept context with Poland, for example, with the United Kingdom for that matter. I mean, all the countries, like-minded nations in this area should work together on this. And the easiest way to do that for all of them are to belong to the same two major organizations, which is the EU and NATO for different purposes.
Thank you, Anna.
Maybe a very brief comment on that, and that is, of course, that as everyone knows, the reason why we need to cooperate much closer with this like-minded group, it is because the perception in NATO and in EU has changed when it comes to Russia. There is no longer a majority that finds Russian military threat and Russian threat one of the top priority on the agenda. And this is, of course, one of the reasons why it is becoming more important to work together with like-mindeds on these particular issues, because it's not going to be the European Union in its bilateral relationship with Russia that is the one driving these issues.
Thank you. I just want to confirm. We continue till 12:15, right? Yes, good. Okay. Then we have the next question from Bo Hugemark. And also for the rest of you, we only have one mic, but I can repeat your questions if you have them further back.
Thank you. Bo Hugemark, Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences. Edward Lucas mentioned one very important thing, that Russia's goal of creating a sense of indefensibility in the Baltic states. And I think one concrete factor there is could be lacking security of reinforcements to the Baltic states in a situation of crisis. And here we have Sweden's role, because Sweden is sitting on the communication routes for reinforcements. So decreased capability from Sweden to defend those would contribute to that sense of defensibility. Is that what does that worry NATO and the Baltic states today?
Who wants to answer?
Ed should answer.
Ed.
Do you want to take a couple more questions first? But I mean, I can answer that.
Okay. Do we have more questions before?
You have, I think the Swedish, in any real sort of hard military conflict, the Swedish island of Gotland is absolutely central. And so I think whether you like it or not, I mean, even if you can imagine a conflict in which NATO was totally determined to defend the Baltic states and Sweden was entirely unwilling to get involved and Russia was determined to attack, there would still be a question about Gotland just because of where it is. So I think you're in this game whether you want to be in it or not. But I think that that's the wrong way of looking at the problem. The real question is the tactics that Russia is using against the Baltics. They want to recreate the 1940 mentality, where the Baltic states realised it only means futile bloodshed if we resist. No one's coming to help us. We aren't even united among ourselves. There's nothing we can do but just try and make the best of it. And I mean, that's a rather extreme way of portraying it, but that basically was a very successful operation from the Soviet point of view, and it's one that the Russians, Russians remember. And you create that indefensibility through a whole range of economic dependencies. This is the only place we get our gas from. Lucrative commercial ties. This is people who've got a very deep personal interest either in not making a decision or in making a decision when the Russians so choose, in dominating the information space so that the public either doesn't worry about the problem or doesn't think there's anything that can be done about it. And I could go on and on and on. Targeted cyber attacks, whatever you like. But this is a very broad spectrum of things. I mean, it matters to you in Sweden because the same things actually echo into you. First of all, you can't be safe if the Baltic states have turned into Moldova. Yeah, I mean that would be a kind of would be the sort of outcome. You don't want to have a Moldova on your doorstep. That's what you'll get if the Russians are successful.
Thank you, Ed. We have one last question in the back. Please say your name.
Thank you. My name is Isabella Jambek. I'm a member of the Parliament. I have a question. We always ask what the United States could do for us, but I think doesn't Europe take a little responsibility for our own security, and couldn't we do more within the cooperation in the European Union?
Okay, one more question. That's the last one. Your name, please.
Yes, hello. I'm Matthes Bryza from the Latvian Foreign Ministry. And just one short comment on what Ed said about the French and their contribution to steadfast jazz. It's not because French are trying to sell something, but because they are the responsible countries that is in NATO reaction force this year that they participate in steadfast jazz, just to put it on the record. And then also the whole kind of spin of debate about Sweden or Finland joining NATO, the way as we see it, we haven't started this debate within Sweden currently or in Finland. The debate was started by Finnish and Swedish own politicians and military leaders on the issue of defensibility of these countries. So it's not because of Baltic states and our defensibilities this debate has started. So I would like to hear what Swedes are saying, especially our friend there, on that matter and the reactions that have been. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike?
Okay, I can answer both questions actually very briefly. On Isabella's view on the European Union, well, the European Union has a lot of good qualities, but military matters are not one of these, unfortunately. And that has been proved the last 10 years very effectively. For simple reasons, most of the European Union countries, about 75% of them are already members of NATO. They don't want to pay twice for a military alliance organization. So they stick with NATO. That's been the case for 15 years now. And despite the fact that the European Union rhetorically has been doing a lot in terms of boosting up its military ambitions and also actually implemented a few minor operations, still there's not necessarily, that is not necessarily the way to go when you want to bolster European abilities on the military field. It's much easier to do that in NATO, and everybody else but Sweden and Finland and a few others know this already. The other issue on the Baltic states, on the Swedish and Finnish defensibility. You're right, you're perfectly right. One of the key factors that has driven the current debate here in Sweden on NATO membership, for example, has been the so-called 1 week